So ever since I was a teenager, I've been fascinated by Anglo-American sports and GT cars, and it all began with a thing called an ISO Rivolta. You see, I was reading an Australian car magazine, and in it was a race report of a pre-1966 historic touring car race. And there was mention of a guy called Laurie Donaher who was driving this thing called an ISO Rivolta, and I was like, what the hell is that? There's no photo, only a description. It described it as a beautiful Italian GT car powered by a small block Chevy V8. And I was completely fascinated. Of course, back in those days, there was no internet, so I couldn't just Google it. And so I sort of became a bit obsessed with this thing, and then I eventually found a photo of it after searching for a long time. And I've sort of had this fascination ever since, and so I thought it'd be quite fun to put together a list of 10 Anglo-American sports and GT cars from the 1960s. So the 1960s was a fascinating decade for small car companies, and most of them followed a fairly similar sort of a formula. They'd design and build their own chassis, and then they'd go to a design company or a styling house to style the bodywork. And then they'd go to mass producers to get most of the mechanical components. So you're talking about engines, transmissions, rear ends, suspension and brake parts, lights, gauges, even windows and doors. So this all saved them the time and the cost of having to produce their own parts. And for companies that wanted to produce a car that was fast and powerful, an American V8 usually offered the best and most affordable option. And all this produced some pretty epic cars, and some real duds. Okay, so this one doesn't count because Allard actually shut down in 1958, but basically this is where it all started. So Allard Motor Company was based in London and opened in 1945, but Sydney Allard was actually producing race cars before the Second World War. Now the pre-war cars were all powered by Ford flathead V8s, and there was actually even one that was powered by a Lincoln Zephyr V12. And these were mostly competition cars designed for trials and hill climb events. Now Allard serviced Ford trucks during the war, and when the war ended, he ended up with a whole lot of Ford V8 parts, and that basically formed the basis for his new company. Now Allard's used a swing arm front suspension assembly, and this created some serious positive camber, and they looked pretty leery. But somehow it just all worked, and they won a lot of races. And Allard exported a lot of cars to the United States, and these were really successful in racing events during the 1950s. Most were powered by either Mercury or Ford flathead V8s, although there were Cadillac V8s as well, and there were also some Chrysler Hemi V8s too. And even though Allard closed down in 1958, the seed had been sown for stuffing American V8s into small British and European chassis. The Facel Vega only just makes it into our list because they stopped manufacturing cars in 1963. Now, if we think of the French car manufacturing industry today, we think of economy cars and small city vehicles and stuff like that. But prior to World War II, and for probably about the next 10 years or so after that, the French produced some of the most high-end luxury cars in the world. Think of Bugatti, Delahaye, Delage, Voisin, the list went on and on. Now before World War II, Facel built handmade bodies for various different French car manufacturers, and then during the war they built Jeep bodies for Delahaye, they built tractor bodies, truck bodies, but in the 1950s they became a car manufacturer in their own right under the name of Facel Vega. And Facel Vega produced a line of high-end luxury Grand Tourers that were powered mostly by Chrysler engines, including DeSoto Hemis and Chrysler Hemis. And these motors were fitted into special tube frame chassis of Facel Vega's own design and cloaked in super stylish bodies. And most Facel Vegas were a two-door 2+2 seat setting, although they did do a 4-door, and they also did convertibles. And they did produce cars in pretty small numbers, but there was definitely a market for them, including the United States. Now where it went wrong for Facel Vega was when they tried to enter the sports car market with a small bore car called the Facelia. Now the Facelia was powered by a 1.6 litre twin cam motor that was designed by Carlo Marchetti, and Harry Westlake was actually also involved in the design of this engine. But it had a heap of problems. So each camshaft only had 2 bearings, and so the cams actually flexed, which threw out the timing. And so the motors basically popped themselves. Now Facel Vega tried to rectify the problem. They did actually come up with a solution and they did fix it, but the damage had already been done and they never actually recovered, and they stopped producing cars in 1963. So you already know the story about the Shelby Cobra, so I won't go into huge detail. But basically it needs to be on our list, and this is probably the most famous one on our list. So basically, Carroll Shelby was a really successful race car driver, and he actually won Le Mans 24 Hours in 1959. But he had a condition known as angina pectoris, or in more simple terms for people like myself, he had a dicky ticker. So he retired from racing, but he had to find a new source of income. Now Shelby didn't have a lot of money, but he was really well connected. And he also had the gift of the gab, and he had really incredible timing. Now Shelby earned a living through 1961 as a scribe for Sports Car Graphic magazine, which was organised for him by his good buddy Wally Parks. And he also ran a driver's school at Riverside Raceway. And he also ran a small Goodyear dealership in a corner of Dean Moon's workshop. But Shelby had grand plans. He wanted to build his own sports car, and he wanted to be the fastest production car in the world. So he approached Chevrolet about helping him with his project because he really loved the small block Chevy V8, thought it was a great engine, which of course it was. But of course Chevrolet already had the Corvette, so that was a dead end. So then he approached Ford, who were just launching their own small block V8, which was being introduced to replace the outgoing Ford Y block. Now Ford were in the early stages of a new marketing program because they had a slightly stodgy image compared to Chevrolet, and so they were about to launch a new performance car and racing program called Total Performance. So they were actually quite interested in talking to Shelby. So now all he needed was a chassis. Now luckily for Shelby, through his magazine work, he discovered that the small AC Cars company in England was in a slightly tricky spot because its supply of engines from Bristol cars was coming to an end. Now AC Cars had a little sports car called the Ace, and it was powered by a 2-litre inline Bristol 6-cylinder engine. Now the AC Ace was quite a popular car in the United States already, and had a lot of success in fact in SCCA production sports car racing in the F production class. It also competed at Le Mans. Now it featured a strong tube frame chassis and a light alloy body that looked a little bit like a miniature Ferrari Barchetta. Anyway, Carroll Shelby got together with the Hurlock brothers who owned AC Cars, and they hashed out a plan. A small block Ford V8 and a 4-speed Borg Warner transmission was sent to England, and they were fitted into an AC Ace chassis. And then they spent the next several weeks doing development work because the V8 kept breaking stuff. Now the prototype was given a chassis number starting with the letters CSX, which stood for Carroll Shelby Experimental, although some people also say the X stands for Export. Now everyone seemed pretty happy at this stage, Shelby himself, Ford Motor Company and the Hurlock brothers, and the prototype was shipped to the United States to Dean Moon's workshop, but it was still in bare alloy. Now, Shelby was then invited to display the prototype on the Ford stand at the 1962 New York Auto Show. It was actually Wally Parks who suggested that he paint it yellow, and Dean Jeffries did the paintwork. The name Cobra came to Shelby apparently in a dream. He woke up, wrote it down, and then he went back to sleep. And as it happened, the prototype was a real hit at the New York Auto Show, and so Ford decided to go ahead with the program. And then the second Cobra was built, which was given the chassis number CSX 2002, and this was also the first race car. Meanwhile, back in England, AC Cars also went into production to produce the Cobra, but in right-hand drive form, and its chassis numbers started with the letter COB. The COB apparently stood for Cobra Other Britain. And AC Cars also produced the Cobra in left-hand drive form, but to be sold into Europe. And these cars were given the chassis number starting with COX, with X meaning export. Now, Shelby American produced the Cobra as both a street car and a race car, and they also produced a small number of drag cars. Now, in 1965, a new Shelby Cobra was launched. It had an improved chassis and coil spring suspension. It was also fitted with a 427 big block V8. And then there were several Cobra offshoots. There was the special lightweight 390 cube flip-top car that raced at Nassau Speed Week in late 1965. There were the Daytona Cobra Coupes, of course. The Type 65 Super Coupe, the AC Cars Coupe, the Wilmot Coupe, and the slightly bizarre Wilmot Gear Coupe. And then there was the AC Frewer, which was built on an extended version of the coil spring 427 chassis. And this was designed as an upmarket Grand Tourer, and it came in both a coupe and a convertible body form. The production of the Shelby Cobra ended in 1967, but AC Cars continued its production of the AC Cobra until 1969. So Renzo Rivolta was a wealthy Italian businessman who in 1939 purchased the Isothermos company. Now, Isothermos made heaters and refrigerators and other household appliances, but Renzo wanted to branch out into the automotive industry, and so basically that's what he did. Now, first there was the Iso Motor motorcycle, and then in the 1950s came the Iso Isetta bubble car. Now, Renzo was a pretty smart cookie, and so what he did was he allowed other manufacturers in other countries to build the Isetta under license, and one of those companies was BMW. But by the late 1950s, he decided he wanted to build his own high-speed grand touring car because he was a proper car enthusiast. Now, Renzo met Nuccio Bertoni at the 1961 Frankfurt Motor Show, and basically this is where the seeds were sown for what became the Iso Rivolta IR300. Now, a young designer by the name of Giorgetto Gazzaro was working for Bertoni at the time, and he styled the Iso Rivolta. It was a proper sexy car too. 2+2, 2 doors, and it had really thin A and C pillars and no B pillars. And it also featured a quite prominent and really stylish hood scoop, and underneath the hood was a 327 cubic inch small block Chevy and your choice of either automatic or manual gearbox. Also, Renzo hired Giotto Bizzarrini to engineer the car, and Bizzarrini was responsible for creating the pressed steel chassis. Now, Bizzarrini had previously worked for Ferrari, and of course he was famously responsible for creating the 250 GTO, but he parted ways with Ferrari in 1961 as part of the Great Walkout. He was then involved with the ATS Formula One team, and then Count Volpi hired him to redesign his Ferrari 250 GT short wheelbase because Enzo Ferrari refused to sell him a new 250 GTO. And Bizzarrini's redesign is what became the famous breadband Ferrari. Anyway, Bizzarrini went on to work for Renzo Rivolta, and the Iso Rivolta IR300 was launched in 1963. And next came the Iso Grifo, which was a beautiful two-seater GT, and it was built on a shortened version of the IR300 chassis, and again it was powered by a 327 cube small block Chevy. Now, Bizzarrini, being a race car guy, figured that there might be a market for a racing version of the Grifo, and so basically that's what happened. Now, the street version of the Grifo was called the A3L, L standing for Lusso, and the competition version was called the A3C, C standing for competition or Corsa. Now, the bodywork for the race car was by Piero Drogo, and it was made from worked alloy sheets held together with thousands of rivets. And the engine was mounted so far back in the chassis that the alternator could only be accessed from inside the cabin. Anyway, the relationship between Rivolta and Bizzarrini became a little bit strained with the Grifo, and the road car and the race car were actually made in two different factories. And then Bizzarrini decided to part ways with Iso Rivolta in 1965, and he continued production of the Grifo race car as the Bizzarrini GT. Now, Bizzarrini built the GT until 1968, and he also produced a couple of other cars as well. There was the 1900 GT Europa, which was built on an Opel GT chassis and had a 4-cylinder motor. There was a mid-engined race car as well, which I think might have competed at Le Mans, and he also made one-off concept vehicles for major car manufacturers as well. Anyway, back to Iso Rivolta. So Renzo Rivolta died suddenly in 1966, and so his son Piero took over the company. 1968, the Grifo was offered with a 427 Corvette motor with tri-power. And also in 1968 came the four-door Fidia S4, which was also designed by Giugiaro. And then in 1969 came the Lally, which was designed by Marcino Gandini at Bertoni. And this was basically the replacement for the original IR300. From 1972, all ISO cars were fitted with Ford V8 engines because Chevrolet, or General Motors, were being a bit difficult with engine supply. But things were pretty difficult in general for Iso Rivolta by the early 1970s anyway. The company was placed on the stock market in 1973, and then it stopped manufacturing cars altogether in 1974. But not before a curious arrangement with Philip Morris Cigarettes to help the young struggling Formula One team owner Frank Williams. The program was called Iso Marlboro and didn't actually last very long at all, and basically that was the end of the road for Iso Rivolta. Well, this is another great favourite of mine, but this company has a really messy background, so you're going to need to concentrate. So TVR was created by a guy called Trevor Wilkinson in 1946, and basically the name TVR was an abbreviation of his first name. Now, TVR has a fairly patchy history with multiple owners, and for probably about the first 35 years of its existence, it was in a fairly perilous state for a lot of the time, until it was purchased in 1981 by a guy called Peter Wheeler. Now, Wheeler built the company up during his ownership, and during that time it created some of the most amazing sports and GT cars in the world. But then in 2004 he sold the company to a wealthy Russian. It was basically gone within 2 years. Anyway, when Trevor Wilkinson first started the company, it was called Trev Car Motors, and he mostly did just general mechanical work and engineering work. But then in 1949, by which time the company was actually called TVR, they built their first chassis. The TVR built each chassis to each customer's requirements, and they were designed to fit various British drivelines. By the mid-1950s, TVR were producing tube frame chassis, and one of these was sold to a racer in the United States called Ray Seidel. He ordered his car be fitted with a Coventry Climax motor. When the chassis arrived in the USA, he had an alloy body fitted to it, and he called it the Jomar. Jomar was an abbreviation of his children's names. TVR then fitted a chassis with two fiberglass Mistral noses by Microplast. There was one at the front and one at the back. And then came an awkward coupe body with a sort of a notchback roof. You see, aesthetics weren't really that important to TVR. They just basically put a body on to cover up the chassis. Anyway, Ray Seidel imported several of these cars to the US, but he had a lot of trouble selling them, basically because they were so ugly. So he asked TVR if they could work on the styling. And what resulted was the TVR Grand Tourer Mark I. Anyway, after a few more turbulent years, Trevor Wilkinson left the company that he'd founded. And they'd also gone through a few different American importers after they'd pissed off Ray Seidel. But then in 1963, a guy called Dick Monick visited from the US. And he told them about a project that he was working on with a Ford dealer by the name of Andrew Jackson Griffith, better known as Jack Griffith. Now basically these guys were in the process of shoehorning a 289 cube Ford V8 into a TVR Grand Tourer Mark III. Now Jack Griffith was actually a keen sports car racer, and he owned a Shelby Cobra which Mark Donoghue had driven a few times in 1963 and 64 before he went off to work for Roger Penske. So basically what these guys wanted to do was a bit of a Carroll Shelby. They wanted to import TVR chassis from the UK and fit them with Ford V8 motors in the US. And actually these things were pretty comparable to a Cobra. They weighed about the same as a Cobra, although they did have a slightly shorter wheelbase at 85.8 inches, which made them pretty snappy. And TVR's had a fiberglass body which was bonded to the tube frame chassis. The TVR really had to ramp up production for the whole project, and was sold in the US as the Griffith 200. In fact, the TVR name itself wasn't actually used in the US. And then when the Grand Tourer Mark IV was released in 1965, this became the basis for the Griffith 400. And the biggest difference was in the styling. The new model had a cam tail and a wraparound rear window, and it used rear tail lights from a Mark I Cortina. Now the Griffith and the Grand Tour looked almost identical. The main difference was that the Griffith had a big hump on the hood just to clear the carburetor. Meanwhile, TVR themselves went into production of their own version of the Griffith, but in right-hand drive for the local market, and it was sold in England as the TVR Griffith. Now Monarch and Griffith had pretty ambitious plans, and this included an all-new car called the Griffith 600. And this was a slinky-looking sports car designed in Italy by Carrozzeria Intermeccanica. And like the 200 and the 400, the Griffith 600 was going to be powered by a Ford V8. So this was all pretty exciting, until everything began falling to bits. So there were customer complaints about issues with both the Griffith 200 and the 400, and then a US dock strike meant that TVR rolling chassis couldn't be supplied to the US. And then Griffith got into trouble with Ford for monies owed. So the whole thing basically went down the gurgler, and with it the Griffith 600 and also TVR itself. Anyway, before TVR went under, they'd created a new car called the Trident, and it was designed by a guy called Trevor Fiore. Now the Trident was a fancy wedge-shaped car that was built on the Griffith chassis, and it was powered by a Ford V8, but only 4 of them were produced before the company went belly up. But a TVR dealer by the name of Bill Last bought the rights to the Trident, and he actually started producing it himself as the Trident Clipper. It's basically the same car initially, but with slight styling changes. Anyway, despite all the money dramas, the Griffith 600 did actually live on, just briefly. Griffith repowered the car with a 273 cubic inch Chrysler motor, but then the money just ran out. The project was taken over by a guy called Steve Wilder, and he renamed it the Omega GT. And the cars were made by Holman Moody, the stock car racing team. But the bodies themselves were produced in Turin. And when this fell over, the project was taken over by Intermeccanica, and it was renamed the Italia. But in all, there was only a handful of cars ever built by all 3 manufacturers. Meanwhile, in late 1965, TVR in England was actually saved by a guy called Arthur Lilly and his son Martin, and they were actually TVR customers. So they started production again of the TVR, including the Griffith. And then a guy called Jerry Marshall, the great racer Jerry Marshall, he brought TVR some positive press because he purchased a TVR Griffith 400 and won a bunch of races with it. And then in 1967, the Lillys replaced the Griffith with a new model called the Tuscan. It was basically the same car, but with some styling updates. And then the Grand Tourer was replaced by a new model called the Vixen, which was built on a longer wheelbase at 90 inches. And so the Tuscan basically followed suit. That was built now on the new longer wheelbase. But they only built a few examples, and then they basically just stopped production. And that, thankfully, is the end of the Griffith story, and just a little tiny part of the very complex saga that is TVR. Only the English would create a super sexy, Italian-styled, American-powered high-speed Grand Tourer and call it the Gordon-Keeble. It was named after its founders, John Gordon and Jim Keeble. But seriously, it's your car, you can name it anything you want. But no, Gordon-Keeble it is. Now the Gordon-Keeble GT was styled by Giugiaro, who also styled the Iso Rivolta IR300, and you can see the similarities. But whereas the Iso Rivolta used a steel monocoque, the Gordon-Keeble had a tube frame chassis and a fiberglass body. Like the Iso Rivolta, it was powered by a small block Chevy 327 cubes, and that was backed by a Borg-Warner T10 4-speed gearbox. Now the Gordon-Keeble actually predated the Iso Rivolta IR300, and in fact the Iso Rivolta basically grew out of the Gordon-Keeble project. But various supply problems and I guess financial problems meant that the Gordon-Keeble didn't actually go into production until 1964. And by that time John Gordon had left the company, and he took with him the rights to the badge that was worn on the hood. But during a press release photo shoot, one of the camera guys picked up a turtle that just happened to be walking past, and he put it on the hood just as a joke where the badge would normally go. And so the Gordon-Keeble GT used a turtle for its badge design, which was kind of tongue-in-cheek because this was actually the fastest 4-seat car available in the world at the time. Anyway, further supply problems and basically setting the retail price too low meant that there were cash flow problems for the company, and it went into liquidation in 1965 after only 82 cars had been produced. But then one of the Gordon-Keeble dealers started up production again, but then failed again after only 17 completed and partially completed cars had been built. So that was a total of 99 cars, which is a bit of a bummer. But fortunately, one more car was built 4 years later out of leftover parts, so that brought the total number to 100. And that was the end of the Gordon-Keeble story. Anyway folks, that's it for part 1. Hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit the like button and the subscribe button and tap that little bell as well so you get a notification when I post up a new video. Anyway, thanks again for watching. We'll catch you next time. Cheers, see ya.